All right, we're back. We're going to go into Alan Watts, The Supreme Identity. This is one of the last books that he wrote. This was written in 1972. He died in 1973. Just starting on page 46, The Infinite and the Finite. There is no point from which knowledge of the infinite can begin other than the infinite itself. From the start, we are in the disconcerting position of setting out to understand something which has no beginning, which cannot be approached from any ordinary finite point of reference. This is perhaps inconvenient and confusing, but the truth remains that one cannot work up to the subject of metaphysics by easy stages. A million to the power of a million is no nearer to infinity than one. Like the Chinese sage Lao Tzu, metaphysics is born fully aged. It comes from the womb an old man with long white whiskers. It has no history, no development. Its earliest known written records are as advanced as its most recent, and all of them plunge straight into the heart of their subject without apologies or preliminaries. In the heart of all things, of whatever there is in the universe, dwells the Lord. He alone is the reality, wherefore, renouncing vain appearance, rejoice to him. The Tao that can be expressed is not the eternal. Tao, the name that can be defined, is not the unchanging name. Om, the eternal word, is all. What was, what is, and what shall be, and what beyond is in eternity, all is Om. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Almost without exception, the sacred writings begin their exposition of the ultimate reality without preface, argument, or proof. The modern philosopher will regard this as hopeless prejudice, for to adopt the existence of the infinite or of God as one's major premise is against every rule of his science. But it cannot be otherwise. For as the reality of light cannot be proved or described in terms of visible shape, the reality of the infinite cannot be proved in terms of the finite. For this reason, every attempt to prove the existence of God by logic is a foregone failure. Logic cannot reach God. It may travel backwards in time, from effect to cause, but as long as it stays in time, as it must, it cannot touch the eternal. That which does not begin with the infinite cannot end with it. The most that can be said is that finite contingencies suggest the infinite. In no sense can they be said to prove it. The stream of existence seems to run from the infinite to the finite, so that one cannot swim against it. For purposes of discussion, one can reach the infinite only by jumping upstream like a salmon. Through the purposes of realization, of true knowledge, it will be seen that, flow as far as it may, the stream can never leave the infinite. There is a parallel to this in ordinary experience. All philosophy, all everyday knowledge, must begin from oneself. It must assume a knower as the given and irreducible basis of knowledge. But no amount of knowledge proves the existence of a knower, for the simple reason that the knower cannot be the object of its own knowledge. By proof the philosopher means objective proof, and if the knower can never be its own object, it can never be objectively proved. Objective knowledge only suggests a knower as the finite only suggests the infinite. And as the infinite cannot be described in terms of anything finite, and is therefore described negatively as the unlimited reality, the knower cannot be described in terms of anything known. The conscious self cannot be called long or short, large or small, black or white, pleasant or painful, for it transcends the various objects of its knowledge as the infinite transcends the finite. But as the infinite is the ground of the finite, the knower is the ground of knowledge. Apart from the knower, or at least the knowing process, nothing whatsoever would exist from the standpoint of knowledge. It is therefore quite idle to entertain any serious doubt as to the reality of the knower, because the knower can no more become its own object of knowledge than a finger can catch hold of itself. The very notion of self having an objective knowledge of itself is actually quite meaningless, one of those concepts which come into being as a result of playing with words. From the standpoint of metaphysics, objective knowledge of the self is not only impossible, but unnecessary. Properly understood, the self is like light, which has no need to illuminate itself, because it is already luminous. We shall see that in metaphysics there is the closest connection, something much more than mere analogical resemblance, between the self as the irreducible ground of knowledge and the infinite. Speaking of the knowledge proper to the infinite as the total knower of the universe, Shankaras says, "Now a distinct and definite knowledge is possible in respect of everything capable of becoming an object of knowledge, but it is not possible in the case of that which cannot become such an object, that is, Brahma, for it is the knower, and the knower can know other things, but cannot make itself the object of its own knowledge. In the same way that fire can burn other things, but cannot burn itself, neither can it be said that Brahma is able to become the object of knowledge for anything other than itself, since outside itself there is nothing which can possess knowledge. There is no possessor of knowledge other than Brahma, because all knowledge whatsoever is a participation in infinite knowledge, and the infinite has no more need to know itself as an object than fire to burn itself." Setting aside the question of true relationship between the infinite and the self, it should now be clear why philosophy and metaphysics alike must begin from an irreducible ground. The philosopher may call this ground an assumption or postulate, but even in his own case it is nothing quite so theoretical. The philosopher's intuitive and subjective knowledge of his own existence as a knower may not be objective and proven knowledge, but in actuality it is something much better, though the manner of thinking peculiar to modern philosophy does not permit its recognition. Objective and scientific knowledge is mediate and relative, but the subjective knowledge of the self is immediate, and thus as absolute and certain as anything in the realm of philosophy can be. Yet it cannot be an object of logical proof. Indeed, objective knowledge is only verifiable as probable, never as certain. For metaphysics, likewise, the infinite is the irreducible ground of all knowledge, and is known immediately as distinct from objectively. As the ground of all beings, it is as free from the limitations and determinations of beings as the knower of those things known. Since both proof and doubt can have reference only to known objects, the infinite is accessible to neither. As ultimate and infinite reality, there is no eternal standpoint from which to doubt it or prove it. We are compelled, then, to take it as a given. Yet there is this obvious objection. We all have the intuitive and subjective knowledge of our own existence, and are therefore quite prepared to call it certain and irreducible, but we do not seem to have the same kind of knowledge of the ultimate reality. How then can we accept it as our starting point? The answer is that in principle the two are the same, all knowledge being a participation in the infinite knowledge, and that for purposes of generating the finite world, the ultimate reality has, as it were, the power of restricting its own knowledge, of becoming finite. This paradox will be clarified when the time comes to show that the infinite and the finite are neither opposed nor mutually exclusive. Because the nearest approximation to metaphysics in the Western world of today is religion, it will be necessary, as we describe the metaphysical doctrines, to transpose them also into their religious equivalents. This is the more important because of the supposed conflict between a metaphysic such as the Vedanta and a religion such as Catholicism, a conflict which is in truth as absurd and impossible as between music and the dance. It is indeed natural for the average Occidental to think that all doctrines about the ultimate reality and the true end of man's life are religious in the same sense as his own. But this assumption is incorrect and is the cause of much wholly unnecessary controversy and ill feeling. Let it be said here, then, that necessary as the metaphysical viewpoint may be to the Western world, there is not the slightest conflict between it and the fullest and most traditional Catholic orthodoxy. If any objections to such orthodoxy exist, they must be adduced on religious and not on metaphysical grounds. There is therefore absolutely nothing of a metaphysical nature to prevent anyone from accepting the traditional Christian doctrines without reservation or alteration. The reason for this absence of conflict is that, as already indicated, the religious mode of knowledge is mediate, objective, and analogical, and does not claim to be anything else. On the other hand, metaphysical knowledge is immediate, being in the sphere of the intellect or the self, whereas religion is a knowledge of the infinite in terms of reason, feeling, and sense. In religion, the formless and imageless ultimate reality is translated into finite images, somewhat as magnetic lines of force are clothed with iron fillings for experimental observation. These images are of three kinds: rational images or ideas, feeling images or values, sense images or sacraments. In creed, in code, the realm of values, and in cult religion constitutes a marvelous incarnation or external projection of the ultimate reality, so expressed as to be meaningful and effective for every level of man's nature. This process is seen as its best in Christianity, whose very essence is the knowledge of the absolute in Christ, who in his human nature is the express image of the Father. He is the analogy par excellence, for in the historical character of Jesus there is a more perfect idea of God that can be expressed in any amount of rational concepts. The peculiar significance of the historicity of Christ as the God-man cannot be properly discussed until we have been through the main principles of metaphysical doctrine. Beginning then with the infinite, we have to understand as clearly as may be what the word means. Inevitably, man's imagination tries to grasp the infinite in terms of size and space, as that which expands outward forever, or perhaps as that which contracts inwards forever. Similarly, the imagination has to think of the eternal as an unending time series, or perhaps as that ever-diminishing point of time called the moment. If the imagination tries to conceive the infinite in terms of knowledge or consciousness, it must perforce think of it an indefinitely vast mass of sentience, reaching out from its center to know every detail of the finite universe and beyond. Here, as it were, is a mind without the material or spatial bounds of the five senses. Its sight reaches in all directions, the rocks and stars are transparent, and no conceivable telescope could outdistance the penetration of its vision into indeterminate space. So too, in terms of power, imagination pictures the infinite as force multiplied without end, to make the simultaneous explosion of every atom in the universe a mere firecracker. But expand, prolong, magnify, and multiply as we may, we are not one fraction nearer to the true infinite than when we began, for the terms of time and space are not applicable to the infinite. To denote the infinite at all in terms of thought, we shall have to outline it by limitation of space and time, calling it the sizeless or spaceless and the timeless. We shall have to try to think of the infinite as having no size at all, so that, regarding it from the standpoint of space, we shall be able to say that the infinite exists in its entirety at every point of space. Or to put it another way, from the standpoint of the infinite, every point of space is absolutely here, for there is not a different infinite at every place. In yet another way, we can say that there is no space or distance between the whole infinite and anything at all. The eternal or timeless must be understood in the same way. Eternity is immediately present at every moment of time, or from the standpoint of eternity, every moment of time, past, present, or future, is absolutely now. At a given moment of time, several separate points in space, such as 5 fingers, may be seen all at once. So from the one moment of eternity, the eternal now, all separate points of time are simultaneously present. The accompanying diagrams may help to clarify this concept, and it's a circle just pointing out to infinity, space-time, much like this, how we talk about everything and nothing. The circle represents time and space. The center point, 0, represents the infinite and the eternal. The same modifications must be made to the imagination's picture of the infinite as the knower of the universe, as infinite consciousness or omniscience. In reality, there can be no possibility of the infinite consciousness knowing things at a distance. Just as every point of time and space is, to the infinite, absolutely here and now, so it knows everything is immediately present to its entire self, without, however, abolishing the distances and the times between the things known. There is an interesting similarity to this in our own consciousness, though with one important difference. Everything that we know is known in our minds. If we have an impression of a tree 10 feet away, the impression both of the tree and the 10 feet are in our consciousness. The tree is an object of knowledge, as well as the space between the tree and our bodies, is immediately present to our consciousness, although this does not abolish the distance between our bodies and the tree. The important difference, however, is this, that our consciousness, though spaceless, is limited by space. We know nothing of what is 100 miles from the tree. And though our consciousness is timeless, because for pure consciousness, time is always now, and even memories are a present experience, it is limited by time. It can focus its attention only on one thing at a time. This paradox will be explained when we come to consider the possibility of the self-limitation of the infinite. But for the moment, the point is simply that things can be at once immediately present to consciousness and distant from each other. In sum, the omniscient must mean that the infinite knows every single object simultaneously. It will furthermore know each object with its entire self, as if each object were the one and only thing to be known, because our consciousness can attend to only one thing at a time. Such a state of affairs is as far beyond imagination as anything could be. Now, it may seem strange to speak of the infinite as conscious as a knowing subject. The modern mind suffers from the odd prejudice that consciousness is a purely superficial outgrowth of reality, and that the more fundamental a power, principle, or substance becomes, the more blind and unconscious it must be. Otherwise, imagine that consciousness is a determination, a finite quality, and therefore inapplicable to the infinite. It is true that consciousness as we know it is to a degree finite and determined. But as infinite being is the necessary ground of finite existence, infinite consciousness is the necessary ground of finite knowledge and experience. Pure consciousness is no more a determination than being itself. On the contrary, the two are identical, and no determinations or objects can exist without them. It is obvious that for us, nothing exists apart from consciousness. For all practical purposes, there is no experience, there are no things where there is no knowledge, there is no reality. This is not, however, to say that we do not know does not exist. In other words, things are things, objects are objects, only because they participate in the infinite being and consciousness. Were the infinite consciousness, consciousness would have emerged ex nihilo in a manner far more contradictory than a fig growing from a thistle. If all things are merely special forms of a primal blind force or substance, consciousness is nothing but a special form of unconsciousness, which is absurd, as saying that heat is a special form of cold, or that energy is a particular mode of inertia. The notion that the ultimate reality must be less conscious than a man is one of the most striking examples of the confusion of the temporal with the eternal. For the idea comes from the observation that things which precede man in time are less conscious, and going back earlier, unconscious. But the supposition that things are fully explainable by what precedes them in time, and that what is earliest in time is closest to the nature of eternity, is pure imagination. Things may, to some degree, be explained in their history, but no amount of history will explain why or how there happens to be in history at all. A principle which will bear considerable thought is that the attempt to explain the present by the past alone is virtually an attempt to derive what exists from what does not. As a sufficient cause of the present, the past has a peculiar disqualification of not existing.